The Ezone and the Blade are the two most popular 98s on the market right now, so chances are if you are looking to buy a 98 square inch racket, it might come down to one of these two, so today I'm going to tell you exactly which one you should choose. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. I've been waiting for a long time for this new Ezone to come out because I really like comparing it to other rackets since it has such a unique frame design. It obviously has a 98 square inch hoop, which puts it right into that mid-plus players racket category, but it also has a different construction and a more modern beam design than we're used to seeing in this category. Most 98s, at least up until a few years ago, were more constant, thin, classic beam control rackets, but people really liked the Ezone. Most versions of this racket have been super popular, and that made other companies start to modernize their 98s. Nowadays, we've got a ton of these hybrid modern players rackets like the Aero 98, the V-Core 98, even the Pure Strike and the Radical also have variable beams, so plenty of potential comparisons there, but I actually wanted to start with the Wilson Blade. The reason for that is that on paper, these rackets look very different, with the Blade having a much more classic construction, but it's not to the point that we're comparing apples and oranges. Yes, the Blade has a constant thin beam and quite a soft flex, but beyond that, there's a decent amount of tech in here to amplify spin, and of course, as I've said a million times on this channel, the Blade also has stabilization tech in the layup. All these things help to modernize the Blade, so while it does look like a classic control frame, it's got more spin, more power, and most importantly, it's more user-friendly than you would expect just looking at it. That's why the Blade is so popular. We're probably looking at the two most popular 98s of the last 7 or 8 years here, so while they might not seem that similar, I think it's a really important comparison to make, and they actually do share a decent amount of playability. Now before we move on, I do just want to remind you, as usual, that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So before we talk about the playability differences, I do just quickly want to go over these racket specs, but I go into a lot more detail about that and the technologies in here in their full reviews, so you can go watch that as well. The Ezone weighs 305 grams, it has a 98 square inch head size, a 16 by 19 string pattern, and then a variable 23.8, 24.5, and then 19.5 millimeter beam. Now this racket has a 315 strung swing weight with head links tour at 52 pounds. I know you guys want to know what string I use in my rackets. And then the flex rating is 59 RA strung, which I tested about 5 times, and that's what it averaged out to. That's obviously quite soft, and actually softer than this current Blade, which flexes at 60 RA strung with head links tour at 52 pounds. Not a huge difference, but it's still there, and I also tested this one about 5 times, and that's what it averaged out to. Now the Blade also weighs 305 grams, it also has a 98 square inch head size and a 16 by 19 string pattern, but like I said earlier, it has a very different beam. This has a constant 21 millimeter beam. The swing weight is quite a bit higher than the Ezone's. This one came in at 325 strung, which is a little bit high for this version of the Blade. I think it's supposed to be around 322 or something like that, but definitely higher than the Ezone, and that's an important difference between these two. They also have different balance points. The Blade has a 32 centimeter balance, and the Ezone is a little bit more head light with a 31.5 centimeter balance. That's about it for the specs. I'm not going to get too into the technology here, but just know that both these rackets have stabilization tech, and don't worry, I will talk about how that affects playability, so let's get into it. The core difference between these two rackets is how they swing through the air and the feel they provide on contact, and the big reason for that comes down to their drastically different beam profiles. When I do eventually get into spin, power, and control, I want you to keep in mind what I say in this section, because a lot of that playability comes back to these core differences. I'm going to start with the Ezone. This has that classic 98 square inch maneuverability, but on top of that, it also has more modern aerodynamic elements, like this thinner triangular throat, like this thick arrow hoop, and because of that, it feels very fast swinging through the air. Especially on ground strokes, when you swing with the racket face parallel to the ground, you can really feel it accelerate through contact. If you've played with any version of the Babolat Pure Aero, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a similar sensation here, although not quite as extreme. But compared to more traditionally molded 98s like the Blade, this has a much more modern, whippy feel. That's especially true with this new Ezone. For me, this is the whippiest Ezone 98 I've ever tested, and this also has a lower swing weight and more headlight balance than the Blade, so this is a quicker racket all around the court. Now the Blade certainly isn't a slow racket. It has a thin beam, and again, that typical 98 square inch maneuverability, but it doesn't have that same really fast, whippy acceleration that the Ezone has. This has a much more traditional swing path. The Ezone is the type of racket that's almost begging you to hit with the modern windshield wiper motion. The blade definitely prefers a more classic full stroke. This is really the first step you want to consider when looking at these two rackets. Because of its quicker design, the Ezone is easier to swing, and you don't necessarily need to have a fast and full stroke to get the most out of it. The blade requires more sound technique, better footwork, more core rotation and all that. And I actually think the way I ended up testing these two rackets together kind of perfectly explains that. I really wanted to test these two together back to back, and the only time I could get a court was at 8 a.m. I'm not used to getting up that early. I'd eaten all-you-can-eat sushi the night before, so I was moving super sluggish at the beginning of that hit, and I was feeling way better with the Ezone. That's because in that stiff, lethargic state I was moving in, I was playing lazy tennis, and I was still hitting a pretty good ball with it. Now, when I say lazy tennis, this isn't a racket that makes you play with bad technique. It's not that at all. But when you are a little bit off your game, or if you're a lower level player, it's easier to play well with this than it is with the blade. That higher swing weight, the more traditional swing path, it just requires a little bit more from you. But once you're playing well, which I started doing after about 45 minutes of this, I started to really appreciate the blade. Now, before I explain why the blade may work better for some of you at a higher level of tennis, I do want to make one thing very clear. The blade is tougher to use than the Ezone, but the Ezone is one of the easiest 98s out there. It's not just the fact that it's quick through the air, it also has quite a thick hoop, which makes its sweet spot quite forgiving, so the blade is tougher to use in comparison, but this is actually a really user-friendly racket considering its specs. Normally, when a racket has a 98 square inch head size and a 21mm beam, it's going to have a really small punishing sweet spot, and it's going to need at least a 330 swing weight and 315 static weight to be anywhere near stable enough. That's not the case here. This racket is totally playable in stock form, and it doesn't have that small of a sweet spot, and that's all thanks to the layup technology Wilson is using in here. This technology makes it so that the graphite flexes more on off-center hits, which effectively expands the sweet spot, making the racket feel more stable and more forgiving at lower swing weights. Obviously, that 325 swing weight is higher than the Ezone's, but it's lower than the 330 would have to be without this tech, which is why it's such an impressively user-friendly frame. Now, here's the thing. If you've watched my videos in the past, you'll know I don't always have the most positive things to say about layup tech, especially when it comes to feel. By expanding the sweet spot and making it more forgiving on off-center hits, stabilization tech kind of blurs the lines between what's in the sweet spot and what's out of it, making the overall feel experience a little bit less pure. I like to call it a little bit more mushy. The blade definitely has some of that mushiness, but the Ezone also has stabilization tech, so it's also a little bit mushy. The main difference in feel is that the Ezone's thicker hoop gives it a less traditional, more rigid flex. The blade has that more classic, constant 21mm beam, which does just naturally give you a bit more feel and dwell time, so while neither of these two rackets provide the most pure feel for the ball, the blade does have a little bit more. This is where I want to go back to what I was saying earlier about how the blade could be better for you if you have a fast and full stroke. You feel the frame flexing and pocketing the ball more than you do with the Ezone, and then the higher swing weight puts more mass behind the ball, which makes it more solid and stable. That combination of stability and feel is something that good players really like because it allows them to dial into a racket, which eventually gives players confidence in their frame, which is obviously something you want when you're swinging big. Now again, the reason I'm comparing these two is because these differences are subtle. It's not just black and white, the Ezone's feel sucks, the blade has the best feel of all time. It's the same thing I was saying earlier about how the blade isn't as forgiving as the Ezone, but it's still a very forgiving racket. The Ezone's feel isn't quite as good as the Blade's, but it still has pretty good feel. One of the most impressive characteristics on the Ezone is that it has that really thick hoop, kind of like a power racket, but then that super thin throat, which makes it way more flexible than it would be if it were thick all the way through. It's not a traditionally flexible feel, and it never will be, but there is something very special about how this design blends the best of both worlds between stable, forgiving, and rigid that you get with a thick beam, and then the softer feel of a thin beam. So those are the core differences between these two rackets, and I am going to talk about how these differences translate to power, spin, and control, but this is a great place to start if you need to pick between these two. We're talking about two very user-friendly 98s here, but the Ezone does give you a little bit more with less effort. The blade is a little bit more demanding, but also has that more classic hitting experience. Now on a separate note, the Ezone's been around for so long that it kind of has its own classic playability, and while it has changed coming from the previous one, it still has that Ezone DNA, and I do go into a lot more detail about that in the full review, but now let's talk about spin. As you can probably imagine, since the Ezone is quicker through the air and has a more headlight balance, it's a little bit easier to whip through contact and brush up on the ball for spin. It's still not a true spin 98 like the Aero 98, V-Core 98, and Extreme Pro though, and that's because you don't get as much string movement here. This is a 1619, but it's not super open, and the grommets themselves are pretty tight, so beyond the aerodynamic design of the frame, there's not actually that much going on to amplify spin. That swing pattern is enough to make it feel a lot like a spin racket, so it complements the more modern spinny style very well, so it is more geared towards a really grindy, spinny game than the blade. Now again, nothing is black and white here. This doesn't have that modern, fast swing pattern, but this is a very spin-friendly racket considering it has such a control-oriented design. For one, that 16x19 string pattern is pretty open. You can see it's actually a little bit more open than the Ezone, at least in the middle of the string bed, and then the grommets themselves are also a little bit wider. Because of that, you get a pretty solid amount of string movement here. Nothing over the top because it's still a control racket. Too much string movement would make it inconsistent, but it certainly doesn't ever feel limited in terms of spin potential. So they're both very spin friendly, and to me, that's really the most important reason for why they are so popular in modern tennis and why they have so much variety. The real differentiating factor here is going to be that swing pattern. The Ezone just feels a little bit more at home, playing a really spin-friendly style, whipping the racket through contact, and it's also easier to generate spin with. The blade is more designed to hit through the ball rather than just spinning it, but it still gives you a lot of spin when you do that, so like I said, you never really feel like you're limited on your top spin shots. Power and control is where things get really interesting between these two, because in theory, the Ezone should be more powerful and less controlled with its thicker hoop, but again, it's more complicated than that. At the beginning of my hit, remember, I was really struggling to move, I was playing a little lazy, I was launching the ball too deep pretty often with the blade. That wasn't the case with the Ezone, and that's because this racket actually has a slightly lower launch angle than the blade, which I know sounds a little bit weird, but I think it's because that string bed is a little bit denser and the grommets are tighter as well. For a racket with such a thin beam, the blade pushes the ball pretty deep, and it's not just because of the launch angle. This also has that stabilization technology, which expands the sweet spot, which creates more power, and it has a higher swing weight. Depth and swing weight can combine to make a racket a little bit tougher to control. This is not the kind of ultra controlled racket that's going to keep the ball in the lines no matter what. It definitely can push the ball too deep. I actually think the Ezone is a little bit easier to control because of that lower launch and the lower swing weight. Now it is really close. This does have a bit more depth than the average 98, but it's certainly not overly launchy. Now things do change when you're swinging full. As long as you don't have the flattest style on earth, you're gonna generate spin with the blade. Remember, like I said, this is a very spin-friendly racket considering its design. The natural amount of spin that you generate here is totally sufficient to control the ball. It does take a little bit more effort and swing speed to get there, but once I was moving better and confidently hitting out, this felt excellent for control. And I want to make it clear, I wasn't thinking about adding spin, I was just playing my normal tennis, and my ball was consistent, accurate, and it came off with a decent amount of spin. The Ezone is also great for control when you're hitting big. It is a little bit more rigid, but it's not wild or launchy. What I will say is that the blade does feel more solid and stable, and it has a more consistent flex. That's what you get with a thin, soft, constant beam. You feel that flex all the way down into your hand, which gives you confidence and a really high sensation of control. So it does feel more like a true control racket than the Ezone. Now remember what I said earlier, the Ezone does have that thin throat, which gives it a much more flexy feel than those more rigid 98s, like the Aero 98 for example, but it's still not quite as buttery and consistent as the blade's constant beam. So the Ezone is a little bit easier to control at slow swing speeds, but once you're really hammering into the ball, there's nothing that provides as good of a controlled sensation as a thin constant beam like this. So I'm still gonna say that the blade is the better control specific racket, but just keep that in mind. If you do have a more compact stroke with a really spinny, wristy technique, you may actually find it easier to control the Ezone. Now power is one of the most impressive characteristics on the Ezone 98. It always has been, and that's definitely still the case here. The fact that you can swing it so fast, so easily, and it has that thicker hoop means you can generate a ton of pace. The blade has a higher swing weight, so it can hit big, but it's less of that free power that you have on the Ezone, and really that's the classic give and take with the thicker beam versus the thinner beam. More feel, more flex, more control with the thinner beam, more big hitting potential with the thicker beam, And in terms of which one strikes a better balance between the two, it's really tough to say. I mean, the blade is impressively powerful for a racket with a control profile like this, but the Ezone is one of the most easy and fun 98s to generate pace with, so it really just depends on what you prefer. Both of these are great if you want both power and control, but if you lean more toward control, then probably the blade. If you lean more toward power, then probably the Ezone. If you want more easy power and control, definitely the Ezone. Also, because the Ezone is so quick to bring through contact and also has more inherent power, it definitely has bigger serving potential than the blade. It's also whippier, so even on second serve, it's a little bit easier to generate that kick serve motion, so to me, this is definitely a better serving racket. Touch shots and volleys are a little more pure with the blade, but there's also something to be said about this really whippy maneuverability you have with the Ezone. It's quite addictive and super easy to react with up at the net. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about who these rackets are for because I've kind of done that throughout the video, but I will summarize it here. If you are a lower level player and you want to try your first 98, these are both great frames, but the Ezone in particular is perfect for that. It plays and feels like a 98, but it's more forgiving and super playable at really manageable weight specs, and it also gives you a really impressive blend of power, spin, and control. The blade also has great variety and user friendliness, but it's not quite as outstandingly well-rounded and easy to use. This is definitely first and foremost a control racket, but it has that modern spin and power element to it because of a couple tweaks in technology and design. It's a little bit more challenging to use, I'll say it one more time, it requires a more full stroke than the Ezone, but it also gives you that classic control racket playability that you don't get quite as much of with the Ezone. Now I also have to say, I completely understand why these are the two most popular 98s right now. They're really the perfect example of how technology can work in control rackets. I know I harp on about how these stabilization technologies kind of ruin the feel sometimes, but you don't need to look at it like that. Neither of these are ever going to give you as pure of a hitting experience as, for example, that T-Fight I reviewed last week, but they are easier to use, they do give you a little bit more for free, and that's very important nowadays. I still prefer the more classic feel of other rackets, but I play some of my best tennis with the blade, and especially with this Ezone, so the technology definitely works, that's for sure. Just quickly before I finish up, I want to touch on comfort, because I know that's very important to some people. Obviously, these are both quite soft and dampened rackets, but because the Ezone has that more rigid, modern beam profile, it's definitely a little bit stiffer than the blade. You really don't have to worry too much about it, but just as an example, I am dealing with a bit of wrist discomfort these days, and I could definitely feel it a little bit more when I was hitting with the Ezone. It could also be that that lower swing weight just doesn't take away from as much of the brunt of the ball, but in general, these are two very comfortable rackets. If you do have any more questions about these two rackets, please don't hesitate to ask me in the comments. But with that said, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and if you do want to demo the Ezone 98 or the Blade 98, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.